Hey, if you're someone who's going through suffering, you're going to be very surprised to learn, and you're going to be comforted to learn that God can do this through your suffering. And it relates to what it means that Jesus was made perfect. And also this mysterious figure Melchizedek is related to all of this. In Hebrews chapter 5, starting in verse 7, welcome to another Bible study walkthrough where we learn how to read and study the Bible. It says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. So before we go any further, what we need to figure out is what was said before this, because when you read the scriptures, make sure you read things in context. So let's back it up a little bit for the sake of context, right? And we'll see, actually, a few verses earlier, it tells us that Jesus didn't exalt himself, but God made him a high priest. He was appointed. And this scripture right here in Psalm chapter 2 is God actually appointing and exalting his son to be the high priest, where he says, "You're my son, today I have begotten you." And then the author of Hebrews references another Old Testament passage that proves the fact that God actually exalted and appointed his son to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, whoever this mysterious figure is. Now we get to verse 7, and I want you guys to think about those ideas up front. You can back it up even more, and I encourage you to do that when you read the Bible. When you read and study the Bible, try and connect whatever you're reading as far back as you can to whatever it is you've already read. So you can go back to chapter 4, you can go back to chapter 3, and trace out all those main ideas and how they relate here to verse 7. But chapter 5 is about the high priesthood and Jesus being the high priest. So with that in mind, that's the surrounding context. It says, in the days of his flesh. What I need to figure out, and I'm already asking myself, is what are the days of his flesh? When you read the Bible, it's very helpful to ask questions, to voice those concerns and curiosities you have and things that don't make sense. Ask those, whether here on the pages of Scripture, and go, what is this, right? Or ask God, would you clarify what the days of his flesh are so I can make sense of whatever the author's concluding about that, right? Because whatever he's about to say is based on me understanding what the days of his flesh are, right? So Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. Another question I have is, who is the one, right? Him who was able to save him from death. Who is this? Who is this? Right? Ask questions, because as you read or as you meditate or even as you backtrack through, the previous chapters, you might get the answers to your questions. Maybe not immediately, right? But at least you're asking the right questions for God to answer through his word and with his word, right? So it says, to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. So maybe one of the ways I start to figure out what are in the days of his flesh is whenever this is, it's when Jesus offered up prayers, and it's when he was saved from death after God heard him because of his reverence. So, in other words, I've already answered the question for you. The person here who's able to save Jesus from death is God the Father, right? So we just put God the Father. That helps me make sense of what I'm reading to know who this is. Another thing to think about is he's giving you clues into what he means when he says in the days of his flesh, right? I can answer the question up front for you right now and say this is just referring to when Jesus walked the earth for the 33 years he did as a man, had human nature as us, right? Took on the human condition, sickness and exhaustion and tiredness and hunger and thirst. And it's pretty much the life he lived on the earth before his resurrection, before his death and resurrection, right? So this is pretty much his human life prior to the resurrection and his death on the cross. How do I know that? Well, because there's something linked to this days of his flesh. In this period of time, Jesus offered up prayers. He was heard. He was saved from death because of his reverence. When did that happen? Well, that happened on the cross, and 3 days later in the empty tomb when Jesus rose from the dead, and the Father raises him in power to display his glory and power through his Son. Right, so this has to be referring to Jesus' human life on the earth before his death and resurrection, right? Because he's saved from death. Not in terms of Jesus didn't go to the cross, but once he died, the Father saved him from being overcome and overtaken by death. And the Father brought him up from that, and he was heard because of his reverence. Something I want to think about is, how does this relate to what has already been said, right? He's already talked about Jesus being a high priest forever, like Melchizedek. He's talked about how high priests would bring gifts and sacrifices to God, especially on the Day of Atonement. That was their primary responsibility. They would bring gifts and offer sacrifices. Well, if I think about that, and I think about the fact that, well, the author is telling us Jesus is the ultimate high priest. Well, right here I see Jesus is offering up a gift or a sacrifice just like the high priest would do. In other words, the high priest on the Day of Atonement would bring animal blood or some kind of incense or sacrificial offerings. Jesus doesn't do that. He brings his own blood. He lays down his own life. He is the sacrifice that is pleasing to the Father, right? So he offers up here specifically, though, in this context, what he's offering as a gift or as a sacrifice are prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Is there any? So when I think about whenever a biblical author or the scriptures reference an event or reference a character, what I want to think about is, can I think of anywhere in the scriptures that fit the description here of Jesus offering up prayers and supplications prior to his resurrection, crying? I can think of the Garden of Gethsemane. I can think of Jesus on the cross saying, Father, please don't hold these sins against them. They know not what they do. Father, into your hands I yield or submit my spirit. It is finished, right? And Jesus there is making cries to the Father, both in the garden and on the cross. So I can think of those events. And the reason I say think of that is because maybe, I'm just going to put a question mark here, maybe those are valid connections. And the way I validate that is by maybe going and reading those other passages, those events that come to mind, those scriptures that come to mind. Read it and think about any connections to this passage. Maybe I should keep reading and think about, if I keep reading, will I still think there's a connection to those old stories and events that took place that I believe are being referenced, right? So when you read the Bible, don't follow all your speculations. Don't assume everything you initially think is true, but do follow the trail of breadcrumbs at times. And sometimes that's the Spirit of God leading you and showing you things that he's making connections to, and other times it's us just making stuff up. But we validate that by reading things and asking and praying, right? So this is to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. So this because of, I'm just going to highlight in yellow for no specific reason. I'm just highlighting things that stand out to me, okay? This phrase, because of, tells us why Jesus was heard. What does it mean that Jesus was heard by the Father? That the noise went into the Father's ears? No, it's that the Father responded and acted by saving the Son from death. Why did the Father do that? Because of his reverence. What kind of reverence is being referenced here? I've never used those two words in the same sentence. What kind of reverence does he have in mind? Right? These are questions. I can't just assume this is just some generic reverence. I can go to a Greek lexicon, look at the definition of the word that's translated reverence. I can look at how it's used in other contexts, but maybe I should keep reading, and the author will explain what kind of reverence he's referring to. Reverence being respect, submission, yielding oneself to, doing what an authority figure says. So this is Jesus revering the Father, right? And actually offering up prayers, supplications. In other words, this, you're supposed to see here, the sacrificial offerings and the gifts Jesus brings alongside of his life. Those sacrificial gifts are prayers, supplications, loud cries, tears, but all within the context of being reverent and obedient and doing the will of the Father. And if you keep reading, he'll tell you what kind of reference he has in mind. Although he was a son, and you go, where in the world does it tell us Jesus is the Son? Well, that's a good question to ask, right? Because sometimes we lose track of ideas that have already been put in our face, right? We lose track of repeating ideas and patterns. So when you read the Bible, if there's a reference to something, and it's as if you're supposed to know that fact, maybe backtrack a little bit. And if you do backtrack, you'll see in chapter 5, just a few verses earlier, he quotes Psalm chapter 2. You are my son, today I have begotten you. This is the Father speaking to the Son, declaring that he is indeed the Son of God, right? So we know that. We know that because the author has told us that. Don't speed through the Bible and miss all the connections that are being made for you. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. So in the middle of suffering, to bring it back to how I started this whole video, there is suffering that this world brings on. This suffering is something, even though Jesus was a son. That's why this word although is here. You're supposed to think, wow, he's a son. Why would he suffer? Why would the Father allow the Son to suffer? Well, exactly. You're supposed to feel that tension and ask that question. That's why he says, although he was a son, as if being a son should exempt him from suffering. That would make sense, and yet it doesn't. The Father allows him to go through suffering, but through that he learns obedience. Now, this is the kind of reverence that we see at the end of verse 7. How do we know that, right? It's because his reverence is the reason that he was spared from death and not given over to death entirely. Whatever this reverence is, it becomes part of the reason why the Father brings him up for the grave. And here we see its obedience even to the point of suffering. Jesus wouldn't have gone into the grave without being obedient to the will of the Father, without truly being willing to suffer and undergo that. There is no resurrection without a death. And for Jesus, there's no death without willingly laying down his life in obedience to the Father as a son, right? So as a son, he learns obedience. And what do you mean he learns obedience? Well, up to that point, the Son, in all his eternal existence alongside the Father, has never undergone something like what he's about to suffer. This is a new experience. This is a brand new event. This is why the author can say, Jesus knows our weaknesses. He says that in chapter 4. So sometimes when you're reading and you come across ideas that sound familiar to what you saw in earlier chapters, maybe go back and look for those ideas. See if there's any concept of suffering or any synonymous terminology used, or do I see the word suffering used elsewhere up to this point in Hebrews, And so sometimes repeating words and ideas, and especially synonymous ideas and words, can tell you what the main point of the passage is. They help you make sense of the main point. So Jesus here suffering is how he learned obedience. Up to that point, the Son had known no such suffering as he went through on the cross, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, but in the sense that he actually yielded himself to the will of the Father to the point that he embodied in his flesh human evil and was separated from the Father, taking our penalty upon himself. Right? So here, the Son is suffering and learning obedience through that. There is a degree of obedience we learn. And I'm just bringing it back to what I said. God actually does this through suffering. There's a kind of obedience we learn as children of God, following in the footsteps of Jesus. There's a kind of obedience we learn through suffering we'd rather not go through. A kind of reverence we learn. A kind of, I now see what my Father's capable of, just as we see Jesus saved from death by the Father. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. So, this word "and" right here, I'm going to highlight in yellow because it's connecting this idea of being made perfect, okay? This idea of being made perfect and being the source of eternal salvation. These ideas are connected to Jesus' suffering. Okay, so the question becomes, what does it mean he was perfect or made perfect? I thought Jesus is perfect morally. Is this speaking of moral perfection? Is this speaking of spiritual perfection, divine perfection? What are we talking about here? Well, perfect here being completed, fulfilled, finished. In this sense, it's him becoming the source of eternal salvation. How do we know that? Because here, the same language of him becoming the source of eternal salvation, right, is the same language of him being made perfect. In other words, this comma right here is just letting you know, I'm about to explain what it means that he was made perfect. Sometimes the authors will do this, where they'll start out with a thought where you have questions and you go, I don't know what that means. And they'll say, hold on, the sentence isn't done, or the paragraph isn't done. I'm going to explain to you what I mean. just hang on. And sometimes they do that, right? Other times it takes a lot longer for them to get to their thoughts and fully explain themselves. But he's made perfect here, and he becomes the source of eternal salvation. In other words, Jesus completes, finalizes, fulfills our eternal salvation by becoming the source. How? Through his suffering, by obedience, by reverence. And remember, all of this is in the context of him being our high priest. Okay? So I should think about these different actions I see of Jesus: learning obedience, suffering, being made perfect, not morally or spiritually, but accomplishing our eternal salvation through his death and resurrection. I should think about all these things and how it connects to him being our high priest, or how it connects to the high priesthood in general. But look at, he becomes the source of eternal salvation. In that sense, he's made perfect through his suffering and obedience to all who obey him. In other words, this salvation, this perfection, this high priesthood, it only benefits those who obey Jesus. Okay? So something I want to ask is, whoa, if that's the case, I really need to figure out what it means to obey Jesus. What does that mean? What am I obeying? What does that look like? Right? So I'll put a question mark here, and hopefully, as I continue reading, the author will explain himself. So this comma, again, he's continuing to explain what it means that he's made perfect. He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of who? This mysterious Melchizedek. Now, I'm not using orange for any particular reason, except that it was just in my hand. So he's designated. That's another, when I read the Bible, and I'm trying to make sense of what it means, what an idea means. What does it mean that he's made perfect? Again, you can go to a Greek lexicon, open a concordance, look at other scriptures, but maybe just read the context. Maybe read what surrounds it. Maybe let the author finish his thoughts, because he explains himself. What it means for him to be made perfect, he becomes the source of eternal salvation. He's designated by God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. In other words, the author himself is doing all the connections for you. Remember how I said, think about how all this connects to his high priesthood. The author himself ends this little section by letting you know, yeah, Jesus being designated a high priest is what all of this is about. In other words, you're looking in verse 7, in verse 8, in verse 9, in verse 10. You're looking at the way in which God appoints his son to be a high priest. You're looking at the way God exalts his son to be our high priest in the likeness of Melchizedek, but even better. You're looking at the way God calls and appoints and chooses his son to be the high priest of those who obey him. You're looking at the process right in front of you. He takes on human flesh, submits himself to the will of the Father in reverence. Through prayer, loud cries, tears, still goes through with it, learns obedience, suffers, willingly lays down his life, and through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, he is made perfect as our eternal salvation. He accomplishes that so that we can have salvation through faith in his name, and he's designated our high priest to grant us access to the Father. And Melchizedek is going to be introduced a little more here, but before the author gets to that, he's going to warn in verse 11 through 14 of something that is really important he needs to address. And that's going to be connected to, he's essentially going to pause on the whole high priesthood and the whole Jesus becoming our eternal salvation. He's going to pause on continuing explaining who Melchizedek is, and he's going to address a side topic that is related. And it has to do with a kind of apostasy. Listen, if you have trouble reading the Bible, you're confused, you're frustrated, you don't know where to start, you try reading and you just get super distracted, we have a completely free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below or at abovereproachministry.com. Okay, we have a 27-day program and 11-day program. They're online courses. They're completely free. They're self-paced. If you want to learn in depth how to learn how to, if you want to learn in depth, let me say it differently. If you want to go deep into learning how to read and study the Bible, this will really help you. I encourage you to check it out, as well as everything else we have at abovereproachministry.com. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough.